In today's video, let's have a look at a chapter of U.S. history that's both painful and eye-opening, one that shaped the lives of two communities whose stories have often been overlooked or misunderstood. We're talking about the African American and Native American experiences throughout history, a relationship filled with both unity and conflict, shaped by the brutal realities of slavery, displacement, and war. Both groups share a common feature: melanin-rich skin. But is that where the similarities end? Stay with us till the end as we explore the unspoken differences between African Americans and Black Native Americans, and explore what it really means to be a true Black American. Now, you might not know it, but the interactions between these two groups shaped so much of the America we know today. The intertwined histories. First, let's break down who the African Americans and Black Native Americans are. African Americans are typically descended from Africans who were brought to the United States as slaves between the 17th and 19th centuries. From slavery to segregation, African Americans have faced systemic racism and discrimination in the U.S. Over time, they have forged an identity shaped by their continuous struggle for freedom, civil rights, and a unique culture that marries African heritage with American experiences. And as for Black Native Americans, these individuals have both African and Native American ancestry, with family ties to indigenous tribes like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminoles. Black Native Americans experienced unique forms of discrimination. Some Black Native Americans were enslaved by native tribes, while others were marginalized due to their mixed ancestry, facing prejudice from both African American and Native communities throughout history. Yet, many Black Native Americans lived freely long before slavery became institutionalized in the United States, playing important roles as warriors and defenders of their tribal sovereignty. For example, the Seminole tribe provided refuge for runaway slaves during the era of U.S. slavery. These escapees, known as Black Seminoles, integrated into the tribe, marrying, contributing to its governance, and living freely. Their relationship with Native Americans was built on mutual cooperation, not domination, highlighting a distinct history of solidarity. Now, before exploring the differences that set both these groups apart, let's have a look at their shared history. The connection between Native Americans and African Americans didn't start on the best of terms. It was European colonial powers that forced these two groups together. Europeans exploited both groups, using Native Americans for forced labor, and later, enslaved Africans. In areas like the Caribbean and southern U.S., native land was seized, and Africans were brought in to work it. But this wasn't the case everywhere. In some places, Africans were even used to force Native Americans to work for Europeans. It was like a twisted game of divide and conquer, where both groups were pitted against each other in the name of colonial profit. But here's the thing. Despite being divided by the colonizers, Native Americans and African Americans often found common ground, especially when it came to resisting their oppressors. As early as 1503, escaped African slaves teamed up with native groups to fight against the Spanish in Santo Domingo. These groups would even form Maroon communities, which were entire societies made up of escaped African slaves and Native Americans who fought together against colonial powers. Two of the most iconic Afro-Indian societies were the Black Carib of St. Vincent and the Black Seminole of Florida. Both groups earned historical fame for successfully resisting European expansion. The Black Carib fought the British in the 1770s, and the Black Seminole fought in the famous Seminole Wars of the 1830s. Although both groups were eventually displaced, their legacy of resistance lives on. They showed that unity between oppressed peoples was not only possible but powerful. Two faces of oppression. But as time went on, slavery became more brutal, and it began to spread into Native American lands. In the Southeast, tribes like the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole started adopting plantation slavery after contact with the British. Sadly, This shift divided Native societies. Some opposed it, leading to bloody conflicts like the Creek Civil War, where African Americans fought alongside anti-slavery Red Sticks. As the South's demand for cotton grew, the U.S. government forced Native Americans off their lands. This relocation, known as the Trail of Tears, also impacted African Americans. Native American slaveholders took their slaves with them as they were forcibly moved to the Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. Now, let's fast forward to the Civil War. Both Native Americans and African Americans had complex, divided loyalties during this period. Most southeastern tribes sided with the Confederacy, partly because the U.S. government had repeatedly broken promises to them. However, many individual Native Americans and African American slaves escaped and fought for the Union. Right after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, finally freed the enslaved population. The newly freed black community saw a flicker of hope. Thanks to anti-slavery Republicans in Congress, sweeping changes were being made. The Civil Rights Bill of 1866 granted black people citizenship, which opened the door to other fundamental rights like voting. And the 15th Amendment legally guaranteed black male suffrage, giving African Americans their first taste of political power. But here's the thing, those amendments were great on paper, but enforcing them? That's where it all fell apart. Southern white supremacists and groups like the Ku Klux Klan had other plans. They were determined to maintain their grip on power, and that meant pushing African Americans right back down. Through violent intimidation, lynchings, and discriminatory laws like the poll tax and literacy tests, African Americans were once again left powerless. And then came the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson ruling in 1896, which legalized segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. The black community was essentially pushed into a second-class existence, segregated from whites in schools, bathrooms, and even public transportation. But just when things seemed darkest, the tide began to turn. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. This decision didn't just shake the education system, it became the spark that ignited the civil rights movement. Now, while African Americans were gaining ground, at least for a while, the Native American story took a very different turn. The end of the Civil War was also a turning point for Native Americans, but not in a good way. At that time, Native Americans weren't even considered U.S. citizens. The 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to African Americans, specifically excluded Native Americans. They were seen as outsiders in their own land. As America expanded westward, the government began forcefully relocating tribes to reservations. The defeat at Wounded Knee in 1890 marked the end of Native American resistance to expansion. These once proud tribes were forced to live in cramped, dirty conditions on reservations, stripped of their traditional way of life. But just as with African Americans, there was a turning point for Native Americans too. After World War I, something changed. Many Native Americans had fought bravely alongside American soldiers, and Congress recognized that. In 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act was passed, finally granting Native Americans the same rights that had been given to African Americans almost 60 years earlier. So when we look back at the struggles of both African Americans and Native Americans during this period, we see two different stories, but both shaped by oppression, survival, and eventual change. African Americans gained rights, lost them, and then fought to reclaim them. Meanwhile, Native Americans faced near total destruction of their society before slowly rebuilding their lives. Shared roots, distinct paths. The interactions between Native Americans and African Americans were anything but simple. But now, let's look at what truly sets African Americans apart from Black Native Americans. One of the most significant differences lies in the legacy of slavery. African Americans are directly tied to the transatlantic slave trade, which forcibly removed millions of Africans from their homelands, stripping them of their cultural and familial ties. But here's where things get interesting. Black identity in America is always evolving. Since the 1960s, waves of immigration from Africa, the Caribbean, and Europe have introduced new layers to the Black experience. On the other hand, Black Native Americans have a unique heritage deeply intertwined with their tribal origins. While African Americans blended African and American influences over centuries, Black Native Americans have preserved many indigenous customs, languages, and spiritual practices. Food also tells the story of this cultural blend. Indigenous staples like corn, beans, and squash are fused with African-inspired cooking techniques, creating a unique flavor profile that reflects both cultures. Then there's language preservation, another defining feature for Black Native Americans, as many work diligently to pass down their ancestral languages. While the cultural makeup differs, African American culture is no less rich. It's built on the resilience of surviving the brutality of slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing systemic racism. Out of these experiences, African Americans created soul food, jazz, gospel, and movements like civil rights and Black Lives Matter, all deeply tied to the struggle for freedom and equality. And as for the question of who is a true Black American, there isn't a definitive answer. African Americans are typically recognized as the primary group referred to when talking about Black Americans due to their shared history of African descent and slavery in the U.S. However, Black Native Americans also share part of this identity, though their mixed heritage may add another layer of complexity to how they identify. In modern discourse, both groups may identify as Black, as racial identity is often a personal and social construct. While both groups share a painful history rooted in oppression, their experiences are uniquely different, reflecting the layers of identity that come with their distinct heritages. The legacy of slavery, the preservation of indigenous customs, and the ongoing fight against systemic racism highlight the richness of Black identity in America. So in your opinion, who counts as the true Black Americans? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more, and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos.